All right, my friendly people of YouTube, let's talk a little more philosophy. I've got another philosophical abortion argument for you. This one comes from Don Marquis. Yes, it looks like it should be Don Marquis, and he should be a character in a Zorro movie, but he's not, and I think that's funny. Don Marquis is as far from a Zorro character as you can get. He was a white dude from Kansas. Other than offering me an opportunity to make my joke about Don Marquis, why did I want to do this video? One, this is widely considered the most important and influential philosophical argument for the wrongness of abortion ever in the history of ever. I also put out a video doing my best to explain what is largely considered the most important and influential philosophical argument defending abortion. And so really, I'd love for people to watch both and see where they overlap, where they conflict, how one might improve their views based on the two arguments. Which brings me to the second reason I want to do it. Most of the popular discussion and argument and debate regarding abortion could really benefit from people taking a look at these two arguments. So if you believe the rightness or wrongness of abortion or the rightness or wrongness of the legality of abortion is important, you probably ought to have the best ideas you possibly can about it. Just considering this argument could help you develop better arguments, better ideas, better reasons for your beliefs regarding abortion. And since this video is about abortion, so it will be talking about abortion, go watch something else if that's not what you're into today. If you think it's going to cause you any kind of stress or drama or trauma, I promise you this video is not worth it today. One more thing, the structure of this video is a little different because the structure of Marquis's paper is a little different than what a lot of people expect. He breaks the paper down into sections and then numbers each paragraph. I'm going to have a slide for more or less each paragraph, and that way if you wanted to, you could go download the paper, read it, and then kind of follow along and see what I was talking about. I'm only doing the first half of the paper because the second half is really him responding to anticipated objections, and I want to hear what your objections are before I explain the objections that are already going to be out there. So all that said, let's take a look at Don Marquis's Why Abortion is Immoral from 1989. In the first paragraph, Marquis introduces what he's going to try to do. He points out that oftentimes in philosophy and academic philosophy, people dismiss anti-abortion positions as being some sort of religious dogma or irrational or confused positions based upon one's religious belief. He wants to show that that's not the case by offering an argument that's going to characterize abortion as being seriously morally wrong. He wants to show that abortion is wrong in the same way that killing an adult person is wrong. One thing that he's going to agree with just about everybody who writes about this topic is that the wrongness of abortion is going to have something to do with whether or not it's seriously wrong to end the fetus's life. He's going to attempt to characterize the wrongness of the ending of the fetus's life, but he's not going to try to cover every single case, try to show you how and why abortions are wrong in every circumstance. He just wants to give you an account that shows that abortion, prima facie, on the surface, in general, is wrong. One of the things he wants to do is distinguish his argument from popular, contemporary, pro-choice or anti-abortion arguments. He points out that those arguments have some similarities, and when we look at those similarities, we can come to understand why people on both sides are so convinced that they're right, and they're so unwilling to consider the opposing view. First, he looks at the typical anti-abortion argument, and he says it goes something like this. Life begins at the moment of conception, and fetuses look like babies. Fetuses also contain all of the same genetic information as adult humans. All of these claims are true, and any one of these show that abortion is murder because it's killing a human being. The standard pro-choice argument, he says, works in a similar way. People will assert fetuses are not persons, they're not rational agents, or they don't have a full, robust social existence the same way persons do. And the pro-choicer, as he refers to them, believes that any one of these claims is sufficient to show that abortion isn't a serious moral wrong, because it doesn't violate a person. Now, both sides believe that their premises are true. It would appear as if we have a standoff. And the first thing he says we're going to need to do if we're going to get around this stalemate is figure out if any of these arguments have a governing principle, a principle that demonstrates and connects the premises to the conclusion that abortion is either seriously morally wrong or morally acceptable. We need to know if we have a moral obligation to the fetus, and if so, why. both sides feel as if they have those principles at the ready. The anti-abortionist will say, it's wrong to take a human life. It's wrong to kill a baby. And the pro-choicer will say, personhood's what gives us intrinsic moral worth. Or it's only wrong to take the life of a member of our community of persons. The typical strategy that then follows is people will attempt to show the weaknesses in the opponent's position with counterexamples or exceptions. And we can see how those will work. According to Marquis, the anti-abortionist tends to advocate for a position of moral consideration that's too broad. They want to include too much or too many things in their argument as to what we have to protect and preserve and has moral value. Because if, for example, they're going to make the argument that anything with human genetic material, or all of the human genetic material required for the development of an adult, well, all of that information's in a cancer cell. So if we're going to say that it has human DNA, that makes it valuable and we ought to protect it, we have to protect cancer cells. Similarly, he's going to say the pro-choicer struggles with too narrow a scope of moral concern, too narrow a category of beings we have to morally consider. Because if we say someone needs to be a full-fledged member of the human community, then we might be okay killing babies and children. Or if we say, well, it requires certain psychological capacities or rational participation in our community, then those with various cognitive differences or impairments might be the sorts of creatures we can just kill. After these concerns and criticisms and counter-arguments are levied, he says the anti-abortionist will come back and say, well, maybe it's not just a human, but a human being that I'm worried about. But the problem there is development. One can't say that the zygote doesn't develop into something. And it may very well be that early in a pregnancy, there is no being there at all. And depending on how one wants to cash it out, you're going to have to find a point at which you're going to say, here's where a being begins. But he says the pro-choice person is no better off if they try to massage their view in order to include infants by talking about social participation or social utility. Those arguments seem just as arbitrary. The symmetry in the positions is neither of them succeed to account for counterexamples. If a human being is a biological category, why is that morally relevant? Why should we care? If we're talking about biological categories, why not just talk about race? Why not arbitrarily decide that black or brown or white people are better than everybody else because they're of a specific sort of biological category? Anti-abortionists' main category of attempting to characterize moral significance, saying someone's human, is either going to be circular or totally irrelevant. Saying someone's human isn't to answer the question of whether or not they're morally valuable. It's to ask the question. Why humans? Pro-choice arguments have a similar problem. Why are particular psychological characteristics the important ones? What degree of development does one have to have? How do you exclude or include those based on particular psychological traits or characteristics and exclude others? It seems like if we're answering the question of who counts by saying a person, and then we say, well, why do they count? Because they are a person. Then the characterization of the psychological capacities required could just be another arbitrary characteristic like one's being human. He then considers a particular conception of personhood from Feinberg. Maybe the persons the pro-choicer is talking about are conscious beings with a sense of identity, who have goals, plans, projects, emotions, interact with other people, are capable of and have relationships, values, interests, etc. Maybe because of all of these characteristics, people have rights, and therefore it's not arbitrary. And Marquis thinks that this has some plausible elements to it, but it also seems pretty implausible in a lot of ways. It seems right that to expect someone to have a moral duty or an obligation or respect someone else's rights, they're going to have some certain cognitive abilities. But that they don't have certain cognitive abilities doesn't mean that they don't have rights, that we don't have duties to them. We extend rights to all sorts of people with cognitive differences or impairments or disabilities, even though they might not have the capacity to enter into contracts or respect other people's duties or rights. He gives the example of Karen Ann Quinlan, who I believe ended up in a coma in a persistent vegetative state, and her parents sued in order to have her unplugged from a heart-lung machine. I think she ended up staying alive for a while with a feeding tube. And the state agreed that they were allowed to do that, to remove her from life support that she had a right to privacy, even though she was in a persistent vegetative state. So it seems as if there's nothing wholly inconsistent with extending rights to those who aren't cognitively capable of entering into contractual agreements or respecting someone else's rights. It seems like we can create a place for fetuses and Karen Ann Quinlan in the scope of moral consideration and moral concern when we recognize that the connection between psychological personhood and moral personhood might not be a one-to-one identical relationship. There might be some persons who demand consideration as morally relevant beings who aren't capable of all sorts of things psychologically. Although it might not make sense to extend rights to someone or something that will never ever be conscious in its natural history, it seems like there are clearly cases where we want to extend moral consideration to beings that might not meet the criteria of psychological personhood, but we might consider them moral persons. Marquis argues this is similar to the weakness in the anti-abortionist position. They can't connect biologically human to morally relevant human in any better way. So the pro-choicer is left in the same sort of bind, according to Marquis, as the anti-abortionist. One's just begging the question by saying, they're morally or not morally valuable because they're persons. Well, why are they persons? Because they're the sorts of creatures that are morally valuable. And the other's saying, well, it's human. Therefore, it's a human moral being that demands moral consideration without any argument at all as to how and why biological genetic characteristics lead or demand moral consideration. Both of those arguments fail, according to Marquis. And he thinks it makes sense that people haven't noticed and accepted and adequately dealt with these sorts of differences because passions run high. People care a lot about this issue, and they really want their view to be the right one. So they ignore all of the counterexamples that don't fit with their worldview, or they just kind of imagine them away by considering them to be like temporary obstacles that'll be figured out, while the opponents see the counterexamples as completely damning contradictions. To an outside observer, Marquis says, it may look like there is no possible resolution, but he thinks he has one. Before we get to his solution, there's something unbelievably important about this section, and I think everybody can look around and see that it's true. The vast majority of popular discussion of these issues isn't a give and take. It isn't thoughtful consideration of the issues. It goes just about exactly as he described. People believe what they want to believe. They give their reasons. They're confronted with counterarguments or objections, and they ignore them because they would rather be right than find the truth. They would rather have their beliefs than good beliefs. Do a quick search of YouTube and abortion arguments, and what you're going to find is people aren't interested in giving really good reasons for their beliefs regarding abortion. They're interested in humiliating the other side and trying to convince people that they're on the winning team. And Marquis is giving you much more than that. Back to Marquis. Thankfully, Marquis is going to give us a way out of this dilemma. He says that what everybody else is fighting about just happen to be accidental characteristics of abortion, accidental characteristics of moral consideration. And if we can find out what is truly essentially wrong with killing adult humans, then we can see whether or not that applies to fetuses. If we can find a principle that explains how and why ending a human life in general is wrong, then we can see if that principle applies to fetuses, and we'll have an answer regarding abortion. So he's going to try to give us that principle. And although there might be exceptions, the exceptions will have to have really good reasons for them. So his initial premise is that he's just assuming. To start with, it's wrong to kill. And right off the bat, he says we can throw out some explanations of what makes killing wrong. First, he says arguments that say killing someone is wrong because it brutalizes the person doing the killing. It turns them into an animal, or they're shirking their identity as a full-fledged person or a member of the community. Seem kind of crazy, because it seems like the person who's being wronged is the person being killed. Or if someone wants to argue what's really wrong about killing is the harm it does to others. If you painlessly kill someone, the harm is really the pain and suffering that their loved ones or the people around them feel. But he thinks that fails because what about the happy loner who doesn't have a ton of people around him? Is that okay to kill him? Or what if your friends and loved ones move on really quickly? Does that mean it wasn't that wrong to kill you? And here we get to the meat of the matter. He argues that what principally makes killing someone wrong is that we are taking from them their future, depriving them of their future, a future that is valuable, in which they can pursue and fulfill their goals, have projects, create relationships, do all the sorts of things that human persons do, and we're taking that from them. Losing one's life is one of the greatest losses one can suffer, not because they're biologically human, nor because they're a person, but because their future is valuable. Some strengths of this view. He says he thinks it passes the is-ought test. The is-ought fallacy refers to an argument made most famous by David Hume in his Treatise of Human Nature. Ultimately, the problem is just because something is the case doesn't necessarily mean it ought to be the case. We can say lots and lots of people are killed for no reason. That doesn't mean lots and lots of people should be killed for no reason. So the challenge for the sorts of arguments we've been talking about is, hey, that it's a human being, that it is a human, doesn't necessarily mean we ought not kill it. What are the characteristics and features and reasons why just being human, just having human genetic material means one ought to preserve its life? Or if someone wants to say, it's a person, it has this unique combination of psychological or social abilities, capacities, or roles it plays. Just because that is the case, why does it mean we ought to treat those beings in a certain way? We'll see if Marquis's view gets him around this sort of problem. The way he says he gets around the is-ought problem is to say, I'm starting from the premise that killing adult humans is wrong. So I'm not trying to prove that it's wrong. I'm just saying, what is it about it that makes it wrong? And he wants to say the wrongness of killing, whether it's a human or an animal, is going to be because it does something to the human or animal being killed. So what makes it wrong to kill humans or animals or whomever it's wrong to kill is some natural consequence of their being killed. He also throws in that a divine command theorist would reject this view. They would say that killing isn't wrong because of the harm it causes to the individual being killed. They'd say it's wrong because it violates God's will or it violates God's commands. And Marquis points out that's all the worse for the divine command theorist. In his words, that's one of the features of divine command theory which renders it so implausible. He goes on to offer two bits of support for this view that depriving someone or something of its future is what makes killing wrong. One, it explains why we think killing is so wrong because we take so much from the person being killed. We're depriving them of a lot, just about everything. Additionally, it's totally consistent with why even those who are really sick and dying want to stay alive, because they value their future. What possible explanation of the wrongness of killing could identify a natural consequence of killing a person that's equally consistent with the attitudes of those who are dying, and that's consistent with our intuitions about the wrongness of killing? Marquis believes that further examination of the view shows the implications of this view strengthen it. It is incompatible with the view that only killing humans is wrong. It could be that another species from another planet comes down, and killing them would be seriously morally wrong. But it might extend to other animals as well, because they too might have futures that are enough like ours for us to want to protect them. Certainly an account of all of the features that make a future sufficiently like ours would be complicated. But that's not a weakness of this theory, according to Marquis, because that's not what he's trying to do. He's just trying to provide an outline or a sketch that illustrates what it is that makes killing adult humans wrong and how and why that applies to fetuses. A third consequence of this view that he thinks is a strength. This view does not entail that euthanasia is wrong. Persons who are sick and suffering and incurably ill are not losing a future like ours. There might be really good reasons for someone to not want to have their future. He points out that this distinguishes his argument from sanctity of life arguments, and he thinks that's a strength, because sanctity of life arguments oppose euthanasia even when there's really good reason for it. More strengths: the future like ours argument doesn't have to gerrymander room for children or infants, or the mentally infirmed or cognitively different. It just doesn't suffer the sorts of weaknesses that personhood arguments do. In fact, it seems like it borrows the strengths from both sanctity of life arguments and personhood arguments, but avoids many of the weaknesses. So because this future like ours argument demonstrates that what's wrong with killing an adult human is depriving them of their future, and depriving someone of their future is seriously morally wrong, then prima facie killing a fetus is morally wrong, because a fetus has a future like us. Additionally, the view doesn't suffer from the problem of trying to extend harm to persons to potential persons. If one calls a being a person because they have a future like ours, he thinks that's the conclusion to an argument, not a premise. So it avoids the circularity and question-begging concerns that both the anti-abortionist arguing that moral consideration should be given to humans because they're human, or the pro-choicer argues we have to consider persons because they're persons. He's saying we have to consider beings that have futures like ours. If considering means you want to call them a person because of that, go right ahead. Another feature that he thinks is a strength of his argument is that it holds a bunch of similarities with arguments against wanton cruelty to animals. Both of the arguments begin with an assumption of wrongness. It's wrong to just be cruel to animals. It's wrong to just kill people. Then they try to identify the wrong-making feature. In the case of animals, he's saying the wrong-making feature is that it causes them pain and suffering. In the case of killing, it's depriving something of its future. Both arguments recognize the wrongness of actions that can be directed at creatures other than adult human persons. He goes on to distinguish his view from a sort of Kantian personhood account. Quick interjection and Kant's account of mistreatment of animals that Marquis is critiquing. Kant's account of how and why it was wrong to be shitty to animals was, animals aren't full-fledged persons, so you don't have any obligation to them not to mistreat them, but you have an obligation to yourself and other humans, because if you mistreat animals, you tend to mistreat other adult humans as well. A super simplified version of it might be thinking of, hey look, serial killers start out by chopping up squirrels. And if you chop up squirrels, you might be more likely to chop up your neighbor. It's a little bit of an oversimplification, but I think it will do for Marquis's concerns. Because he wants to point out that Kant's argument fails because in a world full of Kantian moral agents, the only prohibition on chopping up squirrels is that it doesn't lead to you chopping up Steve next door. Some other features of his account that he thinks are important to mention. First, it only shows that abortion is prima facie wrong. And he uses the term prima facie a lot. And in case someone isn't familiar, it just means on the surface, in general. He's saying all cases of this will be wrong unless there's extenuating circumstances. We can make a generalization that killing people is wrong because it deprives them of a future, but that doesn't mean there won't be exceptions. So it only shows that abortion in general is wrong. Some abortions might be justified if there's going to be a loss to someone else that might be as great as the loss to the fetus of its future. He points out that the exceptional cases may be pretty rare, but he also points out that early in pregnancy, a fetus may not be an individual. And if it's not an individual, it might not have a future like ours. And if it doesn't have a future like ours, then abortions might be okay in those circumstances. One more interjection. A lot of people are going to point out, hey, when is this identity developed? Doesn't this seem to be a problem? Hasn't he just kicked the can down the road and said, now we have to figure out what stage of development an identity takes place as opposed to when life happens or when personhood happens. And there's something legitimate to that critique, but it also might be a strength of Marquis's. He's just advocating for the view that, in general, we ought to start the discussion by recognizing abortion as a wrong. There might be exceptions. And it might be that there are a heck of a lot more exceptions than the anti-abortionists are currently comfortable with. But he wants to have a consistent, principled account, and he's willing to explore those and consider those cases. On that note, he says this isn't a complete account. It's not an attempt to show you how and why each and every case of abortion is acceptable or unacceptable, and it doesn't need to be. It also isn't an account of all of the reasons why killing might be wrong. There might be other reasons that killing someone is just as wrong. But he's only focusing on this. Anytime someone's deprived of a future sufficiently like ours, a future of value, then they're being wronged. And because of that, the vast majority of abortions are going to be serious moral wrongs for depriving the fetus of something that's just about as valuable as anything we have, our futures. And that's where I'm going to end, because the rest of the paper is largely composed of considerations of counterexamples or objection. Again, I hope to see you in the comments section and we can discuss your objections, your criticisms, your concerns, not just of Marquis's view, but of my presentation of it. I am certain I missed some things. I am certain I put things in that you would have taken out or took out things that you would have left in. This isn't perfect as it stands, and it won't be perfect after I edit it. But I hope it gave you something to think about, and I know it will have given some of you something to talk about. Thank you so much for the time.